All right, we are live. Well, we're so happy to be here today and to welcome Joe Martino to Our Bright Future. This is the first Our Bright Future in almost 20 where we've focused on the media, which is kind of amazing for these times. Joe is the founder of Collective Evolution and The Pulse, which are independent media channels that have been really relevant in these times and sharing the truth. And they have a focus on shifting the consciousness of our culture. What really drew us to Joe's work, other than just him being one of the heroes of our time, is the focus on inner transformation, as well as how our collective thinking and our inner lives influence the changes on our planet and the role of media in these shifts specifically. So we all know we talk about how media is an influencer of our hearts and minds, especially in these times. So we're so grateful and excited to share this time with Joe and talk about new media for a new world. So welcome, Joe.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I'll take the first question. Joe, I'm really excited to talk to you. Just a little background, like I grew up in a newspaper family in a small town in North Carolina, so I have an extra kind of deep appreciation for media and the value of at least the honest news, of which there's very little left. But in your case, I'm curious, so you're in a unique position now. You're a voice box for a message that urgently needs to be heard, but is being violently restricted, and that's quite a place to be in as a man, you know. And I'm curious, like when you were growing up, like were there inklings in you of like, gosh, something doesn't feel right about this. This is off. I'm not quite sure about that. You know, this doesn't feel right to me. Where did this, if you were to kind of go back in time and begin to track the thread of your life, where did this kind of movement start to begin and show up for you?
Yeah, for me, it was like growing up, always had an interest in the paranormal. I always had an interest in mysterious things and weird things, and asking my parents the questions like, I don't understand why the world is the way it is if humans have the capability to create it, right? Why is it that there are so many people suffering? I don't understand. Like when you're younger and you watch the 6 o'clock news and you hear of this economic disparity, or, I mean, you don't understand it in those words at that age. You're more like, oh, these people don't have money. These people don't have food. These people don't have water. And you're looking at it going like, my parents get me water. The water comes into the house and then, you know, we have, it goes into a glass, and it's just, why doesn't everybody have this, right? You know, you understand that, you know, some of my aunts and uncles had wells where they just like, that's where they got their water from, and it fed into their house. And I'm thinking, well, there's got to be wells around the world, no? Like, why is there so many people without these basic needs? And the answer was always just, well, you know, Joe, that's just kind of how the way the world works. And I'd always go, I don't understand, because if we're creating all this stuff, then can't we just create the solution too? And you know, as a kid, you don't quite understand the finer details of power and of politics, and why certain things are prioritized and why others, and various you know, incentive structures that exist on the planet that may hold back meaningful innovation. You know, you don't quite get that. And so for me, it was always asking those questions, trying to understand, you know, feeling when I was in elementary school, when I was in high school, I was in college for a little while, always sort of the same feeling, like, I don't know, I kind of want to go deeper. I want to know more. I feel like this isn't quite preparing me for the type of questions I have. This is preparing me for, in a sense, being a cog in a system that exists, which if the system was beautiful, then great. But because the system kind of seems to have all these challenges, do I necessarily want to become a really well-oiled machine within that system? And for me, the answer to that was always, no, I kind of want to see what else can be possible. And so that was the thread really that led me to a passion of wanting to understand not only why the world was the way it was, but what we could do to make it move towards something that is more in alignment with what we all, you know, kind of know in our hearts is something that would resonate more, something that would align on a deeper level with what we know is possible, what we know that we want to play with on a regular basis, as opposed to just kind of accepting that this is what it is. So for me, the idea of being a journalist never entered my mind, ever. Not up until the point where I kind of had to come to terms with the fact that that's kind of what I became, was a journalist. And in the early days of Collective Evolution in 2009, I saw myself as just a writer and a person playing with philosophical ideas, and that was inviting conversations that were trying to be expansive. And then the more I weaseled it all down into like, what is going to make an impact here? That's where I started to cover current events, because that's where it seemed like we could make sense of what was in front of people's faces. And when we can make sense of that, we can ask bigger questions. And that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. And one little thing you mentioned there about college. You said for a little while. I read somewhere that you dropped out of college. That's always such an interesting choice. I mean, I think if I had had the courage, I would have done that.
Mhm.
Multiple times. And I'm just curious, like, what happened for you? Was it something that was just it was too oppressive, or was it related to this kind of yearning for something more?
Yeah, like it's really interesting because I recall back in even in elementary school having this feeling, and this I didn't know what this was at the time. I now kind of recognize it as just my gut, my intuition, like some deeper feeling within myself. But when I was younger, I didn't quite know what that feeling was, but the feeling was, Joe, if you left at school now, you'd be okay. And I'd be like, yeah, but everything, every authority figure in my life is telling me no. Like you have to, if you don't have this, if you don't have that, and they're not wrong entirely. If you don't have a high school education, if you don't have certain things, you can't get certain jobs, right? But there was something about my own feeling that was the earliest times where I felt like this container of learning wasn't for me, and that it might be for some people, but I wanted in terms of a yearning, it was like I think I was looking for something that in some cases allowed me to move a lot faster, in other cases maybe move a little slower, and in some cases explore things that cannot really be explored in the elementary or high school sort of level of the way education functions. And then for me, by the time I got to college, it was this feeling of like I'm only doing this. Like there's a funny story because I I actually applied at the tail end of high school. I didn't want to go to any post-secondary, but I applied, and it was online. So you apply to your 3 colleges or universities, and then all the stuff gets sent away. You receive hey, we got your application letter, we'll let you know in a few months. And so I got all my, hey, we received your application letters, but I never received any acceptance or denial letters. This is the first year that I applied to college, and I was like, well, this is weird. So we called the place that is responsible for handling all the applications, and they were like, oh, all your applications were deleted. And I'm thinking to myself, I didn't delete anything. So they get my mom on the phone and they say, your son probably secretly went in and deleted all these applications because he doesn't want to go. And I'm like, well, I know I didn't do that, but if that's their excuse, then obviously there's a problem here, right? And so long story short, something in the realm of if will or fate or the universe, however you want to call it, had just said, this is not the path for you. But so I went to work that year, and societal pressures of family and friends making me sort of fear that if I didn't follow this, college or university path, that I would end up in a position that I would later regret. I ended up applying again the following year, and I did a program and then dropped out after a year, then another program, dropped out after a semester, did another program, dropped out after 2 semesters, until eventually I said, look, I know, you want me to be here. This is not something for me. I'm not going to do this, and I'm just going to trust how I feel. And it was actually a counselor I was working with at the time when I was dealing with some anxiety and that sort of feeling around this life decision, who gave me the permission. This was the first adult, when I was probably 18 or 19 years old, who gave me the permission to say, you're allowed to drop out of school. Like, you're allowed to do this. If this is not what you want to do, you can do this. And I looked at them like, holy shit, like my aunts, my uncles, my immediate circle has always been telling me, nope, you got to go. You got to go. I know you don't like it, but you got to go. You got to go. And as soon as I had that perspective from another adult, that opened the door for me to play and make my own choices, that was like a huge changing moment in my life. And that's what made me drop out at the end of the day.
Wow. So you already had all that questioning authority, so important in our times, which we'll talk about, and questioning the mainstream narrative. So tell us about the journey to founding Collective Evolution. Was there kind of more of like a spiritual awakening in there too? Like, what led you to that point, and what was Collective Evolution about in the beginning?
Yeah, so essentially, following up on some of the more curious questions I had about paranormal, supernatural, and watching all the documentaries on whether it was called the Learning Channel or they had Discovery, and these mysterious, cool, interesting things, that sort of fed into my curiosity about various things about planetary, almost like planetary awakenings or extraterrestrial influenced narratives on the planet, and that subject matter was coupling at the same time that I had met a person who became a mentor of mine, we were talking about all these things, and they sort of funneled it back to, yeah, but have you questioned things like the ego and where your ideas come from and where your programming comes from, or where your worldview comes from? Like, have you questioned a lot of these things? And I was like, oh, well, I've always had questions about these things, but I've never really gone super deep into my own. And that began a journey that was not only spiritual, but just deeply introspective, navigating the mind, but also the self, and also what you are beyond yourself, right? That inclination of paranormal or supernatural that has always been there, got fed deeper. And it was in that time that I started to come to a deeper understanding of, I want to say, like, you start tapping into a certain level of power that you have within yourself that is very subtle, but it leads you on a path of knowing that what you feel you're doing in that moment just feels right. And you're not too concerned about where you'll be in 10 years or 15 years, but you're more so, this feels right for now. And I can see a plan and I can see a path, and I'll go with it, but I'm not like grasping onto it super tight. Like, this is my life's plan and that's what I'm going to do. So I played within that space. I went with it, and that's what formed collective evolution, was this idea that it feels like there's a big change happening on the planet to some extent, whether you want to look at it within culture, whether you want to look at it within a loss of trust in mainstream infrastructures, people questioning things. Like, there's something breaking down here. And I felt that back in 2009, and wanted to write about that. Just wanted to tell stories of my own experience, my own questioning, and my own observations of the planet, and what was going on. And so Collective Evolution was kind of like a blog to help the collective evolve. And over the course of time, we started making documentaries, trying to, tackle some of these complicated conversations, and went down different rabbit holes and different things. And it led to, at the end of the day, having this, well, this doesn't feel quite grounded enough in our current culture. It feels like we can speak to some people, but there's other people who are also scratching their heads. Something's going on in the world, but that language doesn't work in this culture. So we kind of changed our language a bit and kind of refocused on some current events and saying, okay, you see within current events these different things happening. Why are they happening? What's going on? Does the power does the governmental and citizen relationship that we believe in, is it really what we think it is? Or is there something else going on there? Are there other influences that are playing within politics that is not about what the people really want and need, but it's about, perhaps some lobbying interests or some corporate interests or whatever it might be? What is that story, and why is that story playing out? What in our culture, our thinking, our own perspective of the world is feeding into that and allowing that to be? Why are we so resistant to admitting that there is corruption on a large scale? And so it's kind of examining a lot of that stuff through current events. And over the course of time, we've tried a lot of different approaches to leading to, how can we explore potential solutions, talk about where we can go as a humanity, but at just the right spot where people en masse can actually have this conversation and not feel like it's way too fringe. So we've tried a lot of different ways of sort of getting to that point, and that's kind of how, why Collective Evolution started, how it got there, what it's about, and what we've been doing was always just about trying to foster that evolutionary conversation of how we actually live our lives, see ourselves, how we see each other, how we see our place in the world, all these questions. And what type of world would it create if we had a different worldview that guided the decisions we make?
Yeah, and you guys did really well, if I'm not mistaken. Like, your viewership was in the six figures, at least on YouTube, and there were, I was a viewer. I followed your content. I know many of our viewers did. Members of our Ownstream community followed your content. And it's funny, as you were talking about, kind of 2009 is an interesting time, because it was, I think a lot of people started to kind of like their cages started to get really rattled for various reasons. And, I had a lot of things kind of happen up until that point that had kind of poked cracks in the wall. but I also went straight out in 2008 and voted for Barack Obama, thinking that this is the change. Like we need
Mhm.
change. Then he announced his cabinet, and I'm like, what? These are the same. This is the same crew, you know.
Yeah.
And so it was like, oh, okay, I get it. Like this is, you know, the story that I thought was off to the side about what's going on actually is right. It might be front and center, and I started really pursuing it more, and it feels like a really potent time frame where I think a lot of people got hip to, you know, the real power structures and what's actually happening behind the curtain, so to speak.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I just sorry
I-
to echo that. I saw that a lot in a lot of people that I've, kind of come to know over the last 2 years or so. That 2008, 2009 period is very potent.
Teresa, were you going to add something?
I was gonna say I would come home during those times, and
Yeah.
Stephen, it was really early 2010. Like every time I come home, we'd be in another documentary. It was like
Yeah.
the Zeitgeist trilogy, like the 9/11 documentaries. There's just like one thing after the next. You know, it
Yeah.
was just
Yeah, man.
cracking it down. You know, we had both been on somewhat of a spiritual path then, and it was just like whoa. It was just another like breaking open of kind of like
Yeah.
what we believed was just not true and had been highly conditioned by the media.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Well, Joe, what's interesting in your case is that you had this. So you're doing well. 2019, 2020. You're doing your business. I'm sure you're like of a certain mindset, and then things start to happen. Things start to unravel around the world. We hear talk about this mysterious thing happening in China, and suddenly it's in Italy and in Europe, and oh my gosh, is it coming here to North America? And of course it did. And and so for you, from your perspective, like you're a mouthpiece for a certain message, and
Mhm.
I'm curious, like, first of all, like, as you personally were watching this, were you like, this feels wrong right away, or were you kind of like, oh, geez, maybe this is something to be scared of? Tell us a little bit about your journey with the early phase of the pandemic, and
Yeah.
then I really want to talk to you about kind of what happened to your business, what happened to your platform, and that whole experience, because I think you have a unique perspective on this whole thing about silencing people and censorship, which I think we all really want to hear about. But let first maybe tell us about your personal journey with that. Kind of what was that like for you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So at the very beginning, you hear about it happening in China, and we at the time were looking at the doctors in China that were what you could say is the equivalent of the alternative here, which were doctors that were saying it's not being spoken about a whole lot, but we're treating a lot of people with high dose intravenous vitamin C, and it's working. And when you listen to these doctors, they were talking very open, like they had nothing to gain here, right? It's not like they were trying to sell an injection or anything like that. They were just saying, here's what we're seeing. And what their perspective was that this thing was pretty serious, that they didn't know, quite who it affected the most yet. It was very early, but that it was like, it could have been quite debilitating to some people. Like it was like they would come in and they would deteriorate really fast. And so we're looking at that and we're going, I don't know what to make of it. Like we're media, you want to be responsible. It's hard to tell. And so I took the position of like, look, let's just focus on what we know from the people who've experienced early on, who are basically saying, catch it early and hit it with vitamin C and some other supplements, is essentially what they were saying was showing some results. So we kind of said, all right, look, we don't know exactly how severe this stuff is, but here's what some people are doing. And we kind of took that approach. And I was cautious with people. I was like, look, I would tell my family, I would tell my friends, they would ask me, hey, what do you think of this thing everyone's talking about? It'd be like, I don't think we know enough. I think it's very reasonable to take the approach that let's wait and find out. Let's not go into hysteria or panic, but it's not a bad idea to keep some vitamin C on hand and just, throw it back, take some vitamin D, and then if you do start to feel the sniffles, hit zinc, hit vitamin C, about 3,000 milligrams a day. And like the protocol was kind of there, right? And that's what we knew at the beginning. And so I was cautious, and we were pretty cautious in here. Then after we were like maybe 2 weeks into the lockdown, so the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, when we kind of came into the tail end of that, and enough people started looking at it going, the infection fatality rates don't seem that outrageous. Like maybe this isn't that big of a deal. And then it started to unpack. And then we almost went in here into a position where, okay, well, hold on, maybe this thing's not serious at all. And for a couple of weeks, you're like playing with that, like, where does this fit? What's going on, right? So I'm telling this because as a media professional looking at different thingies, or sorry, looking at different, like this perspective, that perspective, all these different ways of seeing things, there was a very reasonable position of going from, it's unclear exactly what's happening. And your mind can shift and change. And by the time you got to like midway through the pandemic, you started, or not pandemic, but that first year. So now you're in the summer of 2020. So we've had, it started in the March of 2020 in the West. So you're talking about like maybe 4 or 5 months. It was now really clear where the narrative made no sense. And it was like, we knew the comorbidity thing. We knew that early treatments was really important. We knew that some people would show up with extremely bad symptoms and they could die if they weren't treated. And this is where the whole, HCQ conversation comes in, and the other, I won't say certain words because I know we're on YouTube, but that's where these conversations kind of come in. And, that's where we started to go, okay, there's a problem. And we would start to really break that narrative down and try to attack each aspects of the narrative to just kind of make people step away from this sense of panic, uncertainty, and hysteria, and into this more like, hold on, what do we know and what is the right approach? And what it feels like is from about summer to the early part of fall of 2020 till about now, almost every sort of narrative that we put out that of what was going on kept getting later confirmed. And now we're at a point here in 2022 where you're having the chief medical officers of, this just happened today, of the United Kingdom saying, we basically damaged kids massively with our policy throughout COVID, and this was a big mistake. And it's like, well, I mean, we were talking about this in 2020. So what happened? Why did it take you 2 years to come to terms with this? Why did it take you 2 years to talk about this? So that was kind of our approach, was to take it slow and not necessarily jump to, this is a plan to just kill everybody, but what does the evidence say? And yes, there's some fishy stuff going on here, but what exactly is going on and how can we know? Because the challenge that we find is that if you go too far into the realm of this is exactly what's happening and it's all a plan to just wipe everybody out, you've now lost the vast majority of the planet who needs to be in conversation with you. We need to be in conversation with each other. And you kind of have to meet people where they're at if you want to get a result, which is why I often say to people, what's your goal in the conversations you have? Is it to make everybody believe what you believe? Is it to, take them down the ultimate red pill rabbit hole? Or is it to actually make an impact and make a change? Because if that's your goal, then really being sort of open and wise and understanding other people as to where they're at and what might be the right conversation for that moment becomes a higher priority than, this is how deep we can go down the rabbit hole.
What a fascinating point. I know we want to talk about what happened with censorship and the business too, but like we talk a lot in our community about polarization at these times, and how we've been polarized into camps. And it's like, one of the things I really appreciate about your work and your mission is like, is that reaching people to shift consciousness? So it's kind of fascinating when you're creating that media. What are you thinking about versus maybe like what's appearing in the mainstream narrative and what their goal is, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what have you learned about or what did you learn at that time about how to shape your media to reach people? Because I know that my understanding of collective evolution from the beginning was this idea of how our inner and outer world relates, and then how we shift the inner to affect the outer, and the role of media in that. So talk about that at that time and how you were reaching different audiences with that goal.
Yeah. So when you say at that time, are we going back to collective evolution early days or also during the pandemic?
The beginning COVID time, like what you were just talking about how you were navigating reaching the audiences as the world was sort of fracturing in this way.
Yeah. So we saw COVID early on. I remember getting again, going back to that gut feeling, that intuitive feeling early on. It was, just to speak in the third person, it was like, Joe, what's happening is moving very quickly, and it's unclear and it's confusing. Just let it settle for a few weeks and feel out what this moment actually feels like. And so in the first couple of weeks that it hit in North America, the content I was creating was more centered around, we're seeing a massive disruption in the way we live our lives. That is an opportunity to reflect. That is an opportunity to ask questions. And that is an opportunity, like we're literally given that break in narrative that allows us to look at our previous lives and go, okay, we feel so disconnected from it at the moment. We're all stuck at home. We're all doing this, we're all doing that. Like, what aspects of that life did we enjoy? What aspects of normal did we really like? Are we now missing? And what are the aspects we could go without? And what are the aspects we were operating on autopilot? And what are the aspects that we really showed up for and felt really present within, right? So there was all these introspective questions that could have been asked in the early days before all the arguing about all the COVID facts became, a thing, right? And so we centered on that for a little while, which was kind of like the inner journey, the inner questioning. And of course, that inner questioning was able to play out through all of the fact unfolding that took place, which was anything from what is the actual severity of this, to what are the actual solutions, to why are we not talking about them, to why is there such a large scale censorship, to by the time you got to the end of it, why is government literally going on complete character attacks of anybody who asks a question? Like there's no acknowledgement of the information that's being brought forth. It's just a pure character attack. What's going on? How did we become so polarized and so divided? So all of these questions play into asking ourselves these questions as individuals. But the way we decided to formulate our ideas during this time was to kind of say, everything we've done over the last, say, I think it was something like 12 years, asking at that point with collective evolution and leading into wanting to create the pulse. And that's creating the pulse was a little bit in the conversation of censorship, which we'll get to. But when we were creating the pulse, we was an opportunity to say, okay, what was effective? What wasn't effective? What spoke to the choir? What was bridging gaps? What was allowing us to widen the audience? And are we now in an opportunity here where a lot of people in this particular event that took place over the last 2.5 years are a lot of people at a moment where they're open to questioning something, where they're open, because we saw this happening where people are like, whoa, hold on a second, hold on. What's going on here? And so how do we meet that person? How do we, and a lot of it was inspired by, I remember seeing a poll at one point that was looking at the potential for voting in the 2017 US election. And it was broken down into a survey of, I think it was multiple thousands of people in the United States in various political parties, including independent, undecided, libertarian, like everything. So you got your extreme left, you got your extreme right, then you got all the steps in until you get into centrists and libertarians and all these different little pieces. And what you started to realize is the extreme left and the extreme right make up like 20% of the population. And virtually everybody in between is open to a change. So although it feels like that loud minority makes up everybody, it only makes up like a small fraction of people that feel like they're dictating culture, because we're all kind of sitting back going, well, they're so loud. I don't want to talk to anybody that kind of sounds like that because I'll get yelled at, right? So we kind of saw it as, look, there's about, when you fiddle down the numbers, there's at least 60% of the population, probably anywhere, that is actually going, you know what, look, I don't know. I'm curious. I may not have the time to understand all the facts about anything, but like there's enough of me that's open. And then so you go, okay, how do you get to that person? Right? Like how do you speak to that person? Because that's where you're going to be able to speak to a mass that also, interestingly, and this is kind of the pain point of sometimes the community we've been in for a long time. And this is not to not appreciate the community, but to acknowledge like there is a pain point there. And it's that in the alternative thinking space, sometimes there's this idea of absolute certainty on conspiratorial ideas. So it'll be like, well, if it's in the mainstream media, it's 100% false, right? And this type of thinking is actually damaging to the cause in a lot of ways. And it also is typically not open to change. Meaning, if you believe that change can happen, it means that those doctors and academics or scientists or big corporations or governments or people within government who are currently you're critical of, if you're open to change, it means that they can change and they might start changing their mind. And just because they're changing their mind and saying it doesn't mean that it's a psychological operation, right? There's more nuance there. There's more complexity that is more difficult to navigate. And this was from day one, 2009, this was our pain point dealing with the alternative crowd, is that we're part of that crowd, but it's hard to have conversations when people have just believe like, look, I get it. This is it. This is how it works. And there's no point for any conversation. We just need everybody to get what I get. And I think we're in a time through COVID where a lot of people kind of said, okay, maybe I don't know absolutely everything. And maybe things are a little bit more complicated. And that 60% I was talking about is really who we decided to focus a lot of our attention on, because it was people all the time who would tell us, I follow you guys now at the Pulse and this, that, whatever, because I don't believe anything that's happening in the mainstream, but I also am not sure what to make of some of the stuff in the alternative conspiratorial space, and I'm trying to understand. So that's kind of how we approached it, is like, how can we get people having this conversation versus just speaking to the choir over and over and over again, which has its ups and downs too.
So you're somewhere in between Anderson Cooper and Alex Jones.
Yeah, what I would say is it's bringing a good faith conversation to the table. I don't think Alex Jones approaches this stuff from a good faith perspective. I think he approaches it from this is my perspective. And he admits to playing a character, right? Anderson, I believe, is also not a journalist. He's approaching it from the standpoint of, look, the mainstream narrative is right, and I'm going to filter everything through that. Whereas when we can kind of say, like, look, what's the truth? If I'm seeking the truth, like, what's the truth? And that immediately opens you up to a lot more uncertainty and playfulness and curiosity and like, ooh, what is fun? It's like the difference between, watching a UFO ET documentary and kind of like being in this space of wonder and curiosity and fun versus, watching a news segment about the war and being like, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie, right? It might be a lie, but are we having fun while we're doing it? Right? That fun, that playfulness brings about a very different state of exploring something.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I mean,
appreciate
another
that.
thing, I know that's really great. Like, another thing we talk about in our community a lot is the frequency of the message, or like where the message is coming from,
Yeah.
rather than just the information. Like, the information is out there about the truth, but but all these different packagings, it's like, how does it reach certain people? And so
Yeah.
much of it is that frequency. And I think that's a lot of what you're saying, or that's how I'm hearing what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's the idea of, some people serve people at different points in their journey. Some people are more attracted to other voices and all these different. Absolutely, that's a huge part of it. And then, I think also what we're seeing now is that, and I know, again, we asked ourselves this question early on. It was like, is what is happening in alt media working, right? Like, and that's a really difficult conversation to answer, because it's like, sometimes I say yes, sometimes I say no, sometimes I say, are we still in a position on the alt media side where we're just relying on the presenter to tell us what's happening? Or are we, because a lot of times we'll say, oh, I think for myself and I critically think, but if my favorite presenter says this, I just kind of believe it, as opposed to my favorite presenter says this and I go, okay, yeah, I can see how they got there, or maybe I would formulate my opinion a little differently. Like, it's just a slight difference, but that reliance on the presenter being, your source of truth versus creating a space to explore truth, it can be a different thing.
Well, I want to kind of dive into the censorship piece if we can. I think the way I would want to get into this is, as you were going along, Joe, with Collective Evolution, was there a piece of media that you can look back on and say, I think that was what kind of put us on the radar? was there something that you published, whether it a video or a blog post or something that afterwards you could see like viewer numbers dropping? You could see its rankings may have dramatically changed. Was there anything like that? Tell us sort of where this began.
So the censorship, there's kind of two layers of it. The first layer really begins in 2017 with the U.S. election, and there was this was the first time. And again, this is like such a tangent of a conversation, so we won't go into it. But this was the first time that something was different in the way the candidates were for this election. Specifically, when you're looking at Hillary and Trump, and you're seeing what's happening, and there's something very different about this, right? And again, that's a deeper conversation. But the general point is that the people in control of, media and Google and YouTube and Facebook and whatever all seemed to be heavily on Hillary's side. And it was at that moment too that culturally anybody who was on Hillary's side somehow had this position of power in culture that said, we're right. And anybody who is not on this side is wrong. And so you had these academic voices coming out basically saying at the tail end of the election, Hillary lost this election because of fake news, right? It didn't matter that a big part of what people were reporting on all came from WikiLeaks. And there was tons of evidence and there was tons of revelations talking about the corrupt nature of Hillary and her foundations and the stuff that she did. It didn't matter that it was all evidence-based. It was that WikiLeaks equaled conspiracy, and alternative media now had power, potentially enough power to shift an election, right? That was the feeling. And we can argue all day long too about whether elections are even fraudulent or not, right? That's a whole other discussion. But the general sentiment was that enough of culture was supporting Trump, right? And that shouldn't have happened in the eyes of these people. So what happened was a study came out, which was really just like a long list of, these are all of the different websites online that are producing fake news that are impacting our world. And there was anything from satire websites to actual hoax websites to alternative media sites to independent, like high quality journalism. And they tried to categorize all of these different sites as being, fake news or hoax or satire, or, in our case, sometimes uses clickbait headlines. So we got put on a list of what became fake news websites under the categorization that this website sometimes uses clickbait headlines. Well, what does that mean, right? But because we were on that list, we started to see declines in our Google search ranking, in our YouTube rankings, in our Facebook, I guess where we positioned ourselves within the algorithm. All of these things started to change, and it built this culture that moved very, very quickly, that kept trying to put more and more limitations on any websites that were sounding or talking like any of these websites in this list. So it didn't matter if your stuff was real or not, or based on evidence or not. All that mattered was that you were part of the list. So it was a sneaky way of creating a hit list of websites, hundreds of them, I think it was actually thousands, that were basically all swept under as fake news / hoaxes. And that was really the start of a lot of it. And that intensified to the point where by the time we hit 2019-ish, it was like almost impossible to do things like we did in the past. And we had to pivot, and we had been pivoting so much to try and build a new business model to make it work. Then you enter into 2020 with the whole, C19 conversation, and now you're getting into another layer that is not only a lot more extreme and completely unpredictable, but it's to the point where you're sitting there having somewhat of an existential crisis, trying to determine whether or not you can publish something that's completely based on fact, because it goes against the narrative. So you're like, if I publish this and this goes on Facebook, they could just delete my page. If I publish this and put it on YouTube, they could just delete the account. and you have no control. There's no recourse. You're going at the whim. So every single piece of content you're creating, you're sitting there going, okay, let me check all my facts. You check all your facts. Okay, everything looks good. Let me check my title. Yeah, it's not misleading. Okay, did I make a single misleading sentence in here? No, okay. And then still you're getting fact checked, right? Versus the mainstream is they have their own process of standards and rigor, but they're never having a question whether or not a fact checker is going to come and shut down their entire website and their entire business, because it's just not going to happen. So you enter into this like really, really difficult space to navigate where there is absolutely no clarity whatsoever on what's going to happen to your business at any point, no matter how good the content you're doing is. And for us, I mean, we had our YouTube account deleted twice already in the last 8 months. And both times they gave them back, admitting that every single time they gave us a strike, it was a mistake. Now, the strikes are algorithmic based. So now it's just a robot doing it. But they claim that it's reviewed by a person. But none of our reviews were ever given back in an admission of mistake. But then once you complain enough, they come back and they say, oh, you could tell it's a human writing this time. We actually reviewed the account. We realized we made some really large mistakes here. And then they give you the account back. So it's like, I don't think the vast majority of this censorship process is humans. I think probably 80% of it is just robots trying to control what's going on the internet. And it's sucking in massive amounts of high quality journalism and high quality conversation. And the reason why I think they allow that to run is because you'd be able to whitelist certain domains. So you whitelist anybody in mainstream media so they don't get sucked into that vast net of oblivion. And everybody in independent media is, hey, I have no idea what's going on at any point. So that's pretty well what happened. And I would say that right now, it's actually it's letting up a lot. You get away with a lot more now than you did a year ago.
Yeah, we'll ask about why that is in a second. But to your experience at that time, I mean, and that was happening, and we experienced that. We migrated our community off Facebook to a private network, on a much smaller scale than what you were experiencing. But people who were posting in our Facebook group were getting fact checked, like nobody could have a conversation. So it was happening on this macro level where they're censoring media. And you're being so like diligent with your trying to write facts, and then fact checkers come in, right? This whole fact checker phenomenon. But it also is happening just to the individual level, right? Mm-hmm. So this mass level of censorship, like curious what your experience with that, because I know you then went and, I don't know where you were in creating the Pulse at that time, given your experience with the election and everything, but can you talk about your experience? We talk a lot about self-censorship and kind of what the effects of the media have had and these fact checkers and everything on our own ability to express at the individual level at this time. Can you talk about like how you navigated that, what you've seen personally, and just what its effects have been on people generally?
Yeah, so like you said about the individual level thing, even just seeing that an individual Facebook page who posts something can be fact checked, and then that individual ends up as the person that the fact checker is taking down on a website is like, that's how kind of extreme this got. It's like they're just going after anybody who posts. It's like almost like it becomes personal vendettas that these fact checkers have against certain brands or people. And from terms of the self-censorship, and then I'll get into sort of how we navigated this, but the self-censorship became, you're always asking yourself, should we write about this? Can we write about this? What's the potential cost of writing about this? So it's like you can hold the position in yourself that says, I'm going to do what I feel is right no matter what. And I'm going to say what I think needs to be said because I'm going to hold true to my truth. And you can take that approach and believe that, the universe is on your side, but you're playing within a culture that is dead set on shutting down anybody who's saying anything they don't like. So there then becomes this other layer of, okay, if I want to keep doing this and reaching people and having enough financial stability in order to do that, I now have to ask, can I talk about this? Or do I need to try and do a different approach? So you get into having to spend a lot more time trying to figure out what you can even say. and whether you can even say it. And it's like, are there things that, we wish we could have said, or want to be able to say but can't say? I'm going to sort of say no. I think we've been able to pretty well say almost everything we want to say, but that question, enters your mind all the time. What I think becomes the issue is there are certain conversations that I would be curious to have, and I'm not sure we could have right now. And what the problem is people who want to have those conversations then get relegated to BitChute or Rumble or Odyssey, where from our experience, you're kind of more prone to the fringes and the echo chambers of not having good challenging questions and sense making going on at that level. Instead, that's what exists on YouTube, is people challenging each other a lot. And don't get me wrong, there ends up being a sense of an echo chamber on a YouTube channel as well, but there's a lot more opportunity for there to be diverging views, whereas in those alternative platforms it becomes like very much one view, and I think that's problematic in a lot of different ways. So self-censorship definitely is somewhat of a thing. I've seen some people go through it a lot more extremely than others. Like we have some friends that through the course of a lot of these Facebook deletions since about 2017, we have friends that basically dropped their entire business models to basically create content that is completely safe. So they went from saying things they felt like they wanted to say to just, essentially like, feel good stuff, which is useful, but to what extent? And like, can we just exist in feel good content all day long? And if we do, what really are we going to change? And it's a really, challenging conversation there too, because there is something to balancing out, talking about solutions, talking about problems, and having a good positive energy to an extent. But it can't just be one, or like there has to be a myriad of experience here. So, and then in terms of like what we decided with the Pulse, so playing all of that into a brand now, as a brand, is Collective Evolution tarnished, right? So what we would run into is we reach out to somebody, hey, do you want to do an interview? And in this era of cancel culture, they would go, what? Collective Evolution? Yeah, I've not heard of you guys. They type it in and they would see like 5 results of these guys, these guys are bananas, and these guys are this, and these guys are, and you're like, they go, yeah, I'm not sure that I want to associate with your brand, right? And then so you're going, wow, they don't know who we are, what we do, but they're going to believe some random blogger online who claims that our website is bad. That's fascinating, but that's real, because Google, an authority figure, is telling them in the first, second, third, and fourth result that we're bad. So of course, right, we're bad. And so we got to this position where it's like we have a very sort of loyal following, we have a large reach, we have all this stuff, but we asked ourselves the question, has Collective Evolution in this current form served its role up to this point? And can we now potentially serve better by sort of repositioning what we're doing? And, we still have some plans for Collective Evolution and what we want to do with it, but is it more meaningful now to kind of move away from the, poop in the punch bowl that is Collective Evolution, right? And so that's what we did. And we decided to basically say, okay, let's a new brand, it's kind of a new feel to that brand, less, because there was interesting connotations that came with Collective Evolution. Some people thought it was collectivism. Some people thought it was scientific, purely science with evolution and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, even the name had like, some people loved it and some people were like highly critical of it, right? Like, it's the things that happen in the world are hilarious, but it's part of our culture, right? So we are like, let's go with the pulse. The pulse is not only the pulse of what's going on out there, but the pulse of what's going on inside ourselves. How can we navigate both, right? And so that's what we did there, and we sort of framed everything around this concept of having conversation with a larger group of people that was more it was more culturally acceptable now, but without giving up what we wanted to say. So that was a key thing. It's not like we were trying to go, hey, we're going to self-censor to the point where we're not going to say that, we're not going to say that. It was more like, we're still going to have those conversations, but we're going to do so in a way that widens who we can talk to about it.
Yeah, I was, Stephen, do you want to go anywhere? There's somewhere I want to go with this, but I want to see if you want to ask anything else. about censorship
Well,
right
I have a kind of a more general question about censorship. If you want to, Teresa, if you have a follow up about the pulse, which I think you do, why don't you go and then I'll follow
No,
up.
I'm just interested. I noticed when I was reading some of your material about how, all on your articles and videos, there's a direction at the beginning now that basically
Mhm.
tells you to tune into your body, which I think is really fascinating. Going back to the mission of, that this is our inner landscape is affecting how we affect our world. Anyway, I was just curious about how you guys added that on. Was that a new thing with the pulse, and how that kind of affects how you see people working with your content?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did initially launch that on Collective Evolution, um, based on the idea that uh, what we always felt like we were trying to do, which, to be fair, in how fast paced our culture is not always clear to everybody because it's a bit of a new idea. And we were always trying to have the conversation of where current events and personal transformation sort of overlap. Like, how can we understand why current events are happening from the standpoint of who we are as people, and what story can we examine there that might change to how we approach current events. So there was this interplay of conversation, which meant that not only are you navigating some of current events and looking at the news, but you're also navigating personal growth and how we can be more grounded, how we can navigate information better, how we can have more connected conversations, the science behind that, and really exploring some of those deeper, even spiritual conversations within the context of all this. And but that kind of got lost on some people because it would be like they didn't see every piece of content that we did, or they didn't understand that that's what the frame of what we were trying to do our content was within. And to be fair, because it's really hard to see that, obviously, if you're not in this office every day kind of seeing how we're doing things, right? So um, we kind of got to this position. I can't remember what year it was, but it had to have been 2018, 2019, somewhere in there, where on Collective Evolution we said, let's make it more obvious. Let's prime people with this piece, because I don't know if they're actually doing this before they read our content. I know we say to kind of do this, but are they actually doing it? Okay, let's just prime people. So we inserted it in one of those years, and I can't 100% remember, because to be quite honest, this whole last couple of years has been such a blur that it's like you lose sense of like what year was what, right? Um, and we a lot of that was informed by doing a research survey of probably, I think it was about 1,500 or so people in our audience. So that was a statistically significant amount based on the people that we had in our very, very core audience. And we asked a whole slew of questions relating to how our approach in our news and media impacts them on different ways. And we put a lot of time into really like formulating this in a way that would produce a pretty reliable result, which ultimately said that the approach to using specific language, a specific tone, a specific set of open-endedness, asking questions, not telling what's happened, not telling what's right and wrong, not telling this, but keeping things open-ended, helped people not only feel calmer and more grounded, but actually feel like they were exploring things and improving the way that they thought about things, as opposed to just, here's the facts, go sit with it, right? Just that's it. Like we would spark a more open conversation. And so and we always kind of took this line of let's try not to elicit a specific emotional reaction about any particular thing that's happening. Meaning, let's try not to say, well, this is bad, or well, this is really good. But like, how do we play with something a little deeper? And so that basically showed the results that this approach that we were taking was working, and it was doing something, and people were reporting it. And then so we said, well, let's make that approach more aggressive, and that's where that whole pulse thing came from.
Cool.
Gotcha. Cool. I think what I wanted to hear you talk about, and you may not have much to say about this, but as a journalist, when you see a message so clearly crafted and sculpted coming out of multiple channels simultaneously, in some instances, tweets that are exactly the same language, just showing up dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Um, like, how does do you have any sense or any just sort of like, I imagine you've thought about this, like, how does that happen? Like, what is what is the mechanism through which something so shaped and sculpted comes out, and so that, and there's that side of it, and then there's the side of it of like people around the country in the United States, that is, just sort of acquiescing and agreeing. Yeah, I'm going to say that. I'm going to say that. Every so often, you hear someone peel off and say, "I'm not saying that." Ivory Heckler.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know who she is,
Yep.
but she did that, and that was like, oh wow, that was like such a startling thing. She just broke her newscast. Said, I can't talk about this anymore. This is ridiculous, you know.
Yep.
So like, what is your sense of that? Like, who's doing that? How does this happen?
Yeah. Yeah. The news business is so, there's so many layers to it that are like, if people knew, they'd be like, oh, like that kind of feeling of like, really, like that's what's going on. And it depends. Like I'm kind of slow with this because there's specific instances that have different answers as to what happens there. So I think one of the famous ones is, oh, this is a threat to our democracy and blah blah blah, and like all those, literally reading the exact same script. That would be a news package that would be coming out of some organization that's disseminated to all of the different local news and their affiliates and that sort of stuff. That is basically like, it's one of those messages that everybody in media at that level is going to get behind, because it's like, well, this is bolstering up us and what we do, and this is an important thing to put out. And so this news package is essentially prepared by who, I'm not 100% sure, but it would be some PR company, and it would just get disseminated and everybody's just literally going and reading it. Now, does that happen, that script, does that happen for other news stories where the culture of mainstream media is holding a line? No, that would be a little bit different. So like the mainstream perspective on the Freedom Convoy, for example, was not like, hey guys, we all need to say this exact same thing. It's more so like, you control those journalists by culture and by echo chambers within the culture you create in your newsroom. And there are times where you might have somebody who is influencing a newsroom director. I mean, we saw this even with Project Mockingbird, which essentially revealed that intelligence agencies were developing relationships with certain key individuals inside a media organization so that they can get certain stories to go the way they wanted. In more modern times, sometimes it's as simple as, it's very political. Like, look, if you want to keep that, hey, we need you to hold this kind of line. Or a politician who's kind of getting the gears from a media organization calls up and says, look, if you want access to us and you want to continue to be able to do news stories with us, you need to hold this line, right? So there's so much of that plays into it as well. But I would say overwhelmingly, the largest factor that I think is important for people to understand is purely cultural. So you become part of an echo chamber inside that newsroom that is everybody thinking the same way. Nobody wants to ask that difficult question. Nobody wants to be the conspiracy theorist at the table. Nobody wants to, and in some cases they're told, you're not allowed to go down that route. We're not going to do that story. And some stories will just be spiked. It's complicated because there's nothing specific about every single story. It's more so that there's a multitude of things that can be going on. But in that sense, is media controlled? Well, if you can control and engineer mass culture, you can basically control and engineer media. And to me, that's what's going on. There's a larger sort of social engineering of what is acceptable inside mass culture, through which then the media often will regulate themselves into that little box, for profit, for access, for you name it.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for going through that. Like, I'm really curious about, kind of related to that. You mentioned that now you can talk about some things that you couldn't talk about before. And you probably can't talk about certain things. And we'll ask you about Canada in a minute, and Ukraine and some of the other more now topics. But like, what in your impression is going on there? Like, why now is it loosening? And everything's loosening, right? Mandates are going away. Like, why is that loosening? And like, there's more freedom of speech in this area. And then what areas is it kind of tightening in on?
Yeah. So again, this is like a really tough conversation based on, and I feel like every conversation is tough. I feel like I've said that probably like way too many times during this, but the reason why I say it is because it's legitimately a conundrum. Like seeing, like, we have a lot of friends in media, we have a lot of colleagues, and no person has any clear rhyme or reason as to why things are happening. Like nobody can understand why this guy got deleted, but that person didn't. Why, like, there's no clarity whatsoever. It's like sometimes you think it's if you say that word or this word, but then you realize, holy crap, I just put out a piece of content and I said that word a bunch of times and nothing happened, right? So there's this like, what is going on? Nobody knows. But what we do know is that something's going on. And because of that, there's an exhausting mental, you're always stuck in instability. You can never plan for the long term. You can never really know what's going to happen to your business, which may be the point. It's like, hey, we're going to get you to regulate yourself so much because you're so tired of this exhausting instability of knowing that maybe you'll just give up. I mean, I don't know. I don't think that that's entirely what's happening, but it could be part of it, right? You have Mark Zuckerberg just did an interview with Lex Friedman a few weeks ago. Now, this is a complicated one because you could say Mark went through a massive practice session with his PR team prior to, and like, hey, look, if he challenges you, he's probably going to ask you all these questions, right? And here's how you should probably answer or position yourself on these. And he has that in his mind. He's a professional at this point. And then so he goes into that interview with those statements. Or some of what Mark said in that interview is true. So where you choose to fall on that, you leave up to your own gut feeling and intuition and exploration. But some of the things he said were, as Facebook, we're literally re-questioning ultimately whether we went too far, whether we tried to control the conversation too much because we had so much political pressure to do so. And while at the same time, we don't have the technology or manpower to actually do it. And so you have the left is typically who it's coming from saying, well, Facebook needs to do more. We need to do more. You need to do more to shut them down. You need to do more to stop this. And they're going, well, we get a lot of money from the left and we get a lot of political play from the left. So it's like, maybe we should do something, but it's literally impossible to do. So you're going to take down a lot of good people in the process. Maybe Facebook is actually starting to think, did we take it too far? Maybe they're not. Maybe that's all lip service. But what we're seeing is that Facebook appears to be pulling back a little bit, right? It appears they're going after the really, really obvious fake stuff, and they're letting certain things that are more controversial conversations breathe a little more. How long is that going to last? Is it a, calm before the storm? I don't know, because there's a very reasonable conversation to be had that says censorship may only get worse, right? It's a tough one. And YouTube seems to be following a similar line right now, where they're allowing a lot more. Like if YouTube really, really, really just wanted to censor everybody, I mean, Brand would be gone, Rogan would be gone, Dr. John Campbell would be gone, we would be gone for sure. There would be a whole bunch of other people that are gone, but we're still here. So what exactly is happening? It's not a binary on off, this is how it goes. It's really complicated and nobody knows the answer. So when I say things are getting a little easier to say, it's because it feels like we're dealing with less crap, to be honest. And we're seeing more people talk about their certain things. And what's interesting is the mainstream is now starting to admit things like lockdowns may have been a mistake. Like I said earlier, that the way we treated children might have been hugely disastrous, and that there are potentially some other problems with the way we handled this pandemic. And because that conversation's opening up, it almost feels like maybe big tech is opening up. It's again, you see me at a loss for words because that's what it's like. It's like I have no clue, and people that are claiming they know exactly what's going on, I sit me down with them. I can guarantee you that they probably don't know exactly what's going on because it's really hard to navigate this.
Thank you for your honesty on that. Yeah. It's there. I think for many of us lay people, it sort of feels like there's a group. They just figure out what everybody's supposed to say and they just send it out. But it's obviously way more layered and contextualized than that. I think, and as you said, there's a lot of depth to it too, because starting in school, we're taught to just be obedient. We're not taught to think for
Yeah.
ourselves, and it just sort of plays out. Um, so I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about Canada, what's happened there recently, what's happening now, at least, from your perspective. I don't know if you saw this, by the way. Your prime minister is in Germany, I think, and I think he appeared on I think he sat on the floor of like whatever their Congress is called over there, and one lady got up and just smoked him right in front of everybody. I mean, just
Oh,
really let him have it. It was pretty satisfying. Those are few and far between, of course, but but that seemed that that does happen. People
yeah.
are aware of it. Oftentimes they do that for their own political gains, and that's a factor that we all have to deal with too. But like so where do things stand now in Canada? What's actually happening on the ground? Is there any remaining presence? And tell us what you're seeing.
Yeah. So just before I get to that, I want to just put one more nugget on is there like a voice that's kind of just telling everybody in the media what to do? It's like, it's not that there's entirely not. It's more so that it's like, so if you look at like the influence like AP and Reuters have over the news site. Okay, here's a great example. There was a story in 2021 that came out of Japan. So in Japan, a PR release goes to a mainstream media source. That mainstream media source reports, and I'm going to botch the quote a little bit, but it's something to the effect of 6 million doses of Moderna, I believe it was Moderna's vaccine, was pulled because of contamination that is likely metal that specifically reacts to magnets, right? So here's this Japanese news coverage in the mainstream stating that this whatever this contamination was in these 6 million doses is metal and reacts to magnets. Well, in the West, the cultural conversation was everybody putting magnets on their arms and going, look what's happening, right? Whether some of those videos are just it's sticking to oils on skin, whatever. But the point is that was the cultural conversation. When that exact same story gets picked up by AP and Reuters, who is essentially like the beginning of news in the West, right? It's the fact-based only stuff that gets picked up by everybody else. They had completely removed the detail that it was reacting to magnets. They just called it a contaminant, right? So now all of a sudden you have this like, oh, well, this is an inconvenience. So why did AP leave that out? Why did Reuters leave that out? Knowing the influence they have over the entire news cycle. This is where things get like, oh, okay, so if any of these mainstream journalists looked at this story deeper and found that Japanese mainstream coverage where this happened, like I did, they would have been like, oh crap, there's a massive detail being left out here. And it's been done on purpose because that's not a detail you just skip over. You know what I'm saying? So that's where there's a bit of a voice. That's where there's a bit of and then of course, social engineering is a thing. We know this, right? And we know that there are firms, there are marketing firms, there are massive amounts of people that work on behalf of any pharmaceutical. I mean, there's marketing firms that work on behalf of all pharmaceutical lobbies, right? So now you got to think, are those marketing firms influencing the way things are said? And really, when you start to look at it, it's like there are few people that can influence the way a story goes and the way it trickles down the entire news cycle. So I wanted to add that in because these are important little details to that question. I didn't want to be like that guy who's like, yeah, no, there is no like one thing, because there kind of is in some ways, right? And so then in terms of what's happening in Canada and Trudeau and him getting roasted and that sort of thing, what's interesting is that this is a moment where if anybody had sort of any sense of whether there's something wrong in our culture, what happened in Canada is a perfect example of there's something wrong. Here you had a prime minister, which keep in mind, most people who are not privy to Canadian politics might not know that only 30% of the country voted for Trudeau, right? So he's sitting as a prime minister with only 30% of the vote. That's a shocker because most people don't want him there, like by a long shot. But because we have more parties than like in the United States, for example, where it's really just two fighting it out, the vote gets split a little more. So you had like I think it was 32% to the liberals and like 29 to the conservatives. And the NDP took 20 some odd percent. And then the PPC, which is almost identical to the conservatives, took like 5%. Where if that party didn't exist, the conservatives would have won the last election, if you believe the elections happen and all the votes are counted, right? So the general sentiment there is that because there was another party with a different idea, it actually kept Trudeau in power. Now, with that said, the vast majority of the country does not want the guy there. The vast majority of the country does not like the guy. And even a lot of liberals who voted for him and watched the way he conducted himself throughout the course of this pandemic, throughout the course of the Freedom Convoy, lost a lot of faith in him, because he was, in essence, doing the very thing that everybody has ever taught you your entire life not to do, which is generalize people and stereotype people and call them names without ever really knowing who they are and what they're about, and creating massive amounts of polarization and division, and just doing things that are really, it's not a measure of a quality leader. It's not a measure of a quality individual. So why is it that the leader of a country is operating that way, right? It was so like shocking to see somebody conduct themselves that way. And so he has very little support, and I think he knows that. And that's why he made that sort of backroom deal with the NDP to keep himself in power. The NDP being like kind of the Socialist Party of Canada. So he makes this deal to keep in power, because deep down, I think he knows that if he was to do the right thing, he would have resigned during the Freedom Convoy, or right when it ended, he would have resigned. I can see the argument that, hey, don't resign right in the Freedom Convoy during the middle of a pandemic. It'd be kind of chaotic, and like maybe that's not the best thing for people right now. But I can see that argument. But he should be resigning, not making a deal to stay in power to 2025, when the vast majority of the country literally wants the guy dragged out of the office and left in the street, and that's it, right? That was a move that should tell everybody what's happening in politics has nothing to do with what's good for people, like at all. And it has nothing to do with what they want. And so when you see other leaders in other countries and other countries' news outlets attacking Trudeau, it's like, well, I mean, great. I mean, they're calling him out for what he is, which is a person who's grasping onto power, who knows he should, if he was doing the right thing, just simply resign. So it's kind of nice to see that happen in some ways, because it helps other people realize like the support for him is not unanimous. But going into the question now of what's happening with the Freedom Convoy. So, you know, the whole thing was, we want the convoy wanted the mandates dropped in Canada. Specifically, the mandate that most people were really upset about was that unvaccinated people at the federal level, unvaccinated people could not get on a plane, a train, or a cruise. So essentially, they can't exit the country. Some people could sort of sneak across the land borders. Not everybody was checking, but you're supposed to stay put, right? And that affected about 20% of the population, even though Trudeau kept saying, oh no, it's only 10% of the people that are not vaccinated. It was 20% of the people are not fully vaccinated. So 20% of the country is negatively affected by this policy. And they wanted that gone. And obviously that didn't happen. And now we're in a position where all these other countries are dropping these mandates. I don't think any other country in the world to date has a policy that doesn't let people leave. Pretty well every other country in the entire world. And yet here in Canada, the culture in the media is, well, we really need to think hard about whether we should drop this mandate, as if like everybody else in the world has this mandate in place and that Canada is in the mix. No, Canada is literally the only country that has this terrible idea that they're operating off of. So the convoy itself pretty well ended that weekend that everybody was knocked out of there, which I believe was around the 24th of February, if my memory serves correctly. There was maybe about another 7 days of some momentum behind it. People were trying to figure out whether they could sort of reorganize, whether there was something else we could do. And every attempt to try and do something about that sort of just didn't gain any steam. I think a lot of people were a bit tired, a bit exhausted, a bit splintered. Like what a lot of people don't realize is like the people who supported, like just regular, average, everyday people, some of whom were fully vaccinated, like they were getting like, you're not allowed to come to my party, or you're not allowed to come to then my birthday party with my daughter because you supported the Freedom Convoy, because they're all racists, right? So you had this kind of stuff, and people get exhausted by that, right? It's this, and I think this is why, again, this was the move. This was what the government wanted to do, was to make those associating with this seem like terrorists, to make them seem like bad racist people, and they succeeded in that. And I think at this point, that's why, even when there was an event last weekend here in Toronto related to the convoy, one of the organizers didn't even show up. I think there was only about 200 people there. Like, people are kind of done. But at the same time, so are the mandates here for the most part. Like, we don't have any restrictions here. Most places in Canada have no restrictions at all, but that federal vaccine mandate remains. And the latest is that it looks like they're looking at, reassessing that mandate from a requirement to a recommendation. My guess, if you had to ask me, I would say that it'll be gone by May 1st. But honestly, this government is so unpredictable, and I believe that at this point they know the science doesn't align with it. My belief is that they're literally just punishing people. Like, this is a punishment, and that's it, and that's where it's at. That's my feeling.
Yep. And is the general sense that the Freedom Convoy was a big part of what changed this direction? What kind of helped release a lot of these mandates and measures?
I think on more local levels, yes. I think some of the local premiers who wanted to, make sure that they stayed in power, continued their career, they really kind of looked at that. I also think that if you go back to what Rob Ford, who is he's the conservative premier here in Ontario, I don't think he ever wanted any of these mandates. But he said very clearly, while he was at Humber College here in the early days of the pandemic, he's like, if any politician at all goes against what the federal health official says, their career is over. Like, he just said it so it's like, well, there you go, Rob. You basically just kind of revealed that you politicians are not operating off the science. You're literally just listening to what the health official of the federal government is saying. So now it's, well, how do you know they're following science? And because at that level, it's just politics. Like, it's just purely politics. So I think this convoy kind of gave a cultural moment. It gave the premiers a chance to sort of stake their claim and say, I want support if I go against this stuff. And so I think in some ways, yeah, the convoy helped. But if you ask the mainstream media, if you ask any of the politicians at the federal level, they would say, no, nothing we did had anything to do with the convoy. But of course they're going to say that, right? Like, why would they admit that the people had any influence over their decisions, especially the people they don't like?
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, thank you. That makes total sense. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. So we're almost out of time. We had talked to you about an hour and a half, so we're about 11 minutes out. We have a really great question that was sent in ahead of time, which Teresa will ask in just a second. But a lot of our folks are really interested in the financial system and what's happening within the economy. I don't know if you track that like maybe others, but what's your sense of what's happening there, and like, where do you see like crypto in that bigger picture? Is it now set to rise? Is there going to be turbulent times and then maybe a new system comes online? What's your take?
Yeah, I think if I've learned anything over the last 13, 14 years doing this, that it's really hard to sort of make any reasonable predictive where it's going to go or what might happen. There's been a lot of shocker moments where you're like, wow, like, I did not think that like Bitcoin would have dropped like it is and kind of just stayed there. It seemed like it was on a trajectory that made sense to a lot of people, and it would have kind of positioned itself as something that was worth a lot more, but it's kind of stuck right now. And you got to ask the question, why? I have a whole theory on that, but it would be too long for giving a direct answer to this question. I keep a fairly decent eye on what's happening economically and what choices to make for myself, and how to frame this within the conversation of a short-term solution versus a mid-term and a long-term solution. Like, long-term solution is we need to redo the entire basis of the way our economic systems in our society, how it's incentivized to do certain things, that entire story needs to change, because it's through that almost every decision takes place. If our very need for survival is based off of how much money we have, for the most part, right? Like you could go squat somewhere on some land that's crown land and live off grid. But really, like even just to buy land to live that sustainable community, you need money to buy that land, right? And then good luck with the permits to do what you want to do in that town, right? That's a whole other story. But so my general point is that money and that system is the driving force behind so many solutions and so much of how our infrastructures function. Like I said, incentive systems. So on a long term, that's a separate discussion of what do we do right now in this year or this next year, or you know, how do I protect myself while money is necessary? How might I position myself in a way where I can feel more stability? I'm not talking about being rich. I'm saying, how can I feel more stability? And that's difficult because nothing itself right now makes sense in our global markets. Like the fact that our stock markets are doing as well as they're doing after everything that's makes no sense. Money has just been stripped out of the people massively. Everything would suggest that people are struggling and therefore the markets should be struggling, but it's the opposite. Corporations are laughing. And so the stock market is never a representation of how the masses of people are doing. And in that sense, it's like, well, do I put some money here? Do I put it into crypto? Well, crypto, to keep a long story short, because it is so controlled by Bitcoin, because Bitcoin controls so much of the crypto market, it makes it such that if you can control Bitcoin, which I believe at this point, there's enough mainstream money in Bitcoin that they can control enough emotion behind it to control the entirety of the crypto market. So I believe that there's enough influence of powerful people on the crypto space that the only way the crypto space becomes independent of the dollar, so to speak, is if the people come together with enough faith to create that. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now. That's just my personal feeling. So in that sense, utilizing the existing systems and trying to have conversations about how this doesn't really make sense and how we need to, it seems to be like where it's at, right? Like I like to have conversations with people about stuff and try and open them up to new ideas. But to me, the reason why it feels there's no clear solution is because I literally don't think there is one. And I've looked at a lot of people talking about a lot of different things. I just put out a video today on YouTube talking about solutions and why they're so hard to come across. I've literally met with inventors, here in Toronto who have energy devices that can make it so that we have energy forever. And I'm not talking about pulling from the ether energy. I'm talking about magnets. And I was at this meeting with a number of other investors from South America, hotel and casino financiers from South America, and a whole bunch of engineers who are all vetting this technology. And we're all looking at the same thing. We're all understanding what's going on. You're seeing the engineers get really excited about how this technology works because it's blowing their mind about how they thought of energy in the past. And you're seeing this solution. It's right here. It can be connected in parallel and you can run entire neighborhoods off this stuff. It's not expensive to create. There's very little, if not any, maintenance. This solution is here. It's been here for 10 years. It's possible. What was happening? Well, the people who wanted to bring it to market were getting into fights about who owned it and who could make enough money and this, that, whatever. So you had these old incentive structures blocking the ability for this technology to make its way into society, right? So the old ways of thinking are trying to control and influence and manipulate the movement of a technology that seems to be meant for a different type of society, a society that isn't about hoarding, that isn't about mine versus yours, that isn't about control, that isn't about if we have all this energy, are we going to use it responsibly, right? Or is it going to infuse, like, for example, a lot of people would say to me, well, if I had this technology, I would just run a warehouse full of Bitcoin mining machines and I'd be rich. And I'd go, that's great, but is the point to be rich, or is the point for us to create a thriving society, right? What type of thinking is coming to these technologies? What type of thinking is behind what's happening? And I think that's where I believe there's this almost mysterious intelligent force that is holding some of these technologies back for a moment where humanity is a little bit more sitting in a different space within their mindsets, within their worldview, within their culture, that would be more accepting of these technologies. And just to kind of wrap that up into the financial discussion is, I believe we're in a time where it's very, very difficult to know what's going to happen 6 months from now, never mind a year from now. I don't think it's a bad idea to sort of diversify into some of these other options. But I think the biggest thing, and what I tell people all the time, is find ways to minimize debts, to live as simply as possible. And I don't mean live, like you have nothing. I'm talking about live within your means, whatever those means are, live within them, and learn how to grow food, and learn how to be somewhat self-sustainable, how to work within local community. Because if something does happen, that support network will be there, and that knowledge to do certain things will be there, because I don't think anybody can reasonably predict what's going to happen. Like every crypto prediction I've seen over the last, 5 years has pretty well, maybe like a small percentage of them have been right. And I just feel like there's more power in trying to determine and just basically simplifying our lives right now, and doing what we can to just live a little bit more simply. I mean, that's the approach I personally take.
Wow, Joe, we could have like a whole nother conversation with you
Yeah.
about where the new economy and what we want to create. That is a big topic in our community
Huge.
right now. And where you just went, I want to go so many places with that I know we can't right now. So maybe another time. But we had a few closing questions about the future of media, but I'm going to ask the one that was submitted ahead of time as kind of the closing question, because I know it comes from a longtime fan of yours. So from 80 in our community. Hi, Joe. I've followed your awakening for years, and you've helped inspire me to be an honorary truth teller to all I meet. Where do you see yourself in the new future paradigm? Thanks for all you're doing to help others awaken.
Where do I see myself in the new future paradigm? This is an interesting question. In terms of, I'll kind of try and answer it from a bit of a brand perspective, but also a personal perspective. And in terms of where I see what we're doing, it's sort of this question of we're trying to produce a new way of looking at media, a new relationship with media that is perhaps a little more focused on how can we thrive, how can we live a world that's more connected, how can we live a world that's slower. Somebody asked a question in our membership today about what do you think the commonality is, if you will, between the invention of the printing press back in the 1500s, which produced all of these enlightening moments and these changes in society because people now had access to information. What do you think the parallels between that and the advent of the internet today and how that's changing things? And I said, well, the biggest difference that comes to mind is people's access to information now is like this, but we are so busy. We move so fast. We are in so much noise, and we almost don't sit enough and get to calm and think and engage and feel and determine whether we're just stuck in our minds about a topic or whether how we actually feel about a topic, because we don't do that as much as we did perhaps as a collective in 1500, where life was so much slower. There were other challenges that we had, there were other problems that were existing, but you hear stories of how different life was and how much we were able to engage with stuff like this differently. I think the noise of today is challenging, and I see more and more media organizations, again, this goes back to incentive structures, they're incentivized on YouTube, on social media, to just pound out content constantly. And whatever is the biggest thing that's happening, we have to talk about it. And it's the biggest, and we played that game for periods of time over the course of our career, because that's like what you feel you have to do. But then you're also like, is this producing what we want to produce? Is this leading to where we want to lead? Maybe it's time to slow down media. Maybe it's time to try and ask deeper questions. I mean, we've always tried to ask deeper questions, but maybe even deeper, or maybe slow it down, make more space for conversation. And that's kind of the role that we see ourselves in. And it, and really bringing this conversation of transformation into the mix. And for me, in my more philosophical sense of how I feel, I just feel like there's a world that I've always felt was possible since I was a kid, and I'm just trying to bring that to fruition as much as I can, because it's like, that's what drives me. That's what drives the work. That's what drives everything. So my position as a person is, how can I bring it on a community level, in my work, in my everyday interactions, whatever it is, because it's like, at the end of the day, that's what drove everything that I do. And yeah, it's interesting to think about your role in that, because you can also judge yourself in it. Like sometimes I'm like, wow, if I'm doing this deep dive investigative piece, how is that playing into the story of, you know, creating a beautiful world, right? But you're like, at the same time, that deep dive investigative piece has that person over there go, oh man, I never thought about it that way. What else didn't I think about that way? And they start a journey, right? So it's like navigating that. Like, I feel like my role goes wherever my heart takes me, and it's not always super duper clear in terms of a very linear logical answer. It's just kind of like, it is what it is, and that's kind of how I feel. I hope that offered something, but it was a little convoluted.
No, that is so beautiful and so true. And it feels like it's so connected to who you are. And I'm not surprised that in a way, though it felt surprising to hear it, that the answer is to go deeper into the body, because I feel like that's where everything is at right now. That like
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of things are going from the inside out. And I just appreciate so much your sincerity and tenderness, Joe, because it's so clear that you are connected to your mission. And it's not linear. Like the things we feel called to do sometimes, like it's like we don't know why we're called to do that, and we don't know the ripple effects it's going to have, right? But that's
Yep.
the magic of how change happens, I think. And we get taught that it's one way, but like whatever that impulse you're having is relevant and
Yeah.
beautiful, and so sincere. So I just really appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Yeah. And following that impulse is where I think the embodiment work of like following an impulse, whether it be I have to go pee type of impulse, to I want to get up and go move, to there's something about this is that's driving me, even though it doesn't fit into what I thought I should be doing. That impulse is part of the intelligence of the body, the intelligence of the system, the intelligence of perhaps a deeper energy that, again, whether you want to call it your higher self, whether you want to call it your heart to your, God, whatever it is that you want to put a label on it, that's part of what's guiding you to do what you need to do. So embodiment then becomes really important in order to listen clearly to that, and be able to delineate between an impulse versus like a reaction that might be based on a different emotion or a different story.
Huge. I feel like that questioning has been huge in my own interaction with media, and the whole thing at this time has been, just learning to listen,
Mhm.
which is a lifetime journey, but especially at this time when the noise is so loud, as you were saying, it's like really learning to listen, really learning to tune in and find the direction from there and not from any external authority, whatever
Mhm.
it is.
Yeah, and
So
also to kind of just feel into like as you were talking earlier, Teresa, about the integrity of the vibration from which this message is, being sent. And in the case of Joe and your project's Collective Evolution of the Pulse, it's very high. And I think you represented that really clearly today in this conversation. And just your
Thank you.
thoughtfulness in wanting to be really clear, but also not sort of like be the old model of like definitive and this is right and that's
Mhm.
wrong and it's black or white, and it's like we're really tussling here in a gray area with a lot of these challenging events unfolding, and I think you spoke to that really beautifully, so thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for noticing that and sharing that feedback. Appreciate that.
Well, we're 5 minutes over time. I guess that means we're at a wrap. Is there anything you would like to leave us with, Joe, or maybe share with folks how they can follow you, where they can find you and connect with what you're creating now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, collective evolution is sort of sitting still at the moment. So I'll direct a lot of our, to the Pulse, which is the Pulse.1. And we're on social media. From there, you'll be able to find our YouTube channel, our Instagram, our newsletter, all that kind of stuff. And we're just trying to create a mix between written and video content right now. And from there, for people who want to support, we also have a membership, and you'll find that on the website. But yeah, and then to leave, I just appreciate what you guys are doing and creating a space for these types of conversations. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are sitting in this space. If we know something is not quite right with what's going on, and that it's very bumpy and it's very unclear and unstable. And the interesting part about it is there isn't yet a clearly formed way forward. So when you're in the position where something is kind of falling away and there's no clearly formed direction to go, it feels like, what the heck do I do? And I have no idea what to do. And I think a lot of people are feeling that. But what you guys are doing in creating the space is helping to form that idea of what's to come, which is an uncomfortable space to sit in, but needs to be sat within. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Fantastic.
All right, everybody. Well, I'll make us unlive in just a minute, but let's say goodbye. Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Great to be with you all today.
Thank you.